Good day to you from OG Benchmarks. After several misfires, here is my first real thin mini-ITX build. It's a system with an LGA 1155 motherboard. It's nothing groundbreaking, but I do like how it turned out. Let's go through the parts and see how it runs. Here is the heart of the build. This is the Intel DH61AG motherboard. I think this is Intel's first thin mini-ITX motherboard that meets its thin mini-ITX specification. That makes this board kind of cool. This motherboard does have an LGA 1155 socket. The chipset is H61, which makes it from the Sandy Bridge era. That's Intel's second generation. It does have some nice features. One, it has a mini-SATA slot. This is kind of the predecessor to an M.2 slot. Second, this board does have an HDMI port. Some boards, especially older minimal boards, only have VGA output. Being a legitimate thin mini-ITX board, it has SODIMM RAM slots that lay flat on the board just like a laptop. These are DDR3 with a total limit of 16 gigabytes. I picked up this board off eBay for about $50 shipped. That's a pretty decent price. Despite being about 10 years old, it's hard to find these for under $50. The CPU is next. This is the i3-2120T. This is a 2-core, 4-thread CPU. Like all i3 Sandy Bridge CPUs, it doesn't have a turbo boost. The T designation means it's low power at just 35 watts TDP. The standard TDP for a Sandy Bridge i3 is 65 watts. Just 35 watts sounds bad, but it's good for this build. It's hard to get really good cooling in these thin ITX builds, and the lower TDP will help on the thermals, but hurt on the performance a bit. It does have integrated graphics, important because this build won't have room for a dedicated GPU. I got this CPU off eBay for about $7. Old CPUs don't hold their value nearly as well as old motherboards. Here is the case. I don't know if you have looked at home theater PC, HTPC cases, but these things are mostly a bit lackluster. This case, however, is actually more handsome than your typical HTPC case. It doesn't really have any extra features, but it looks a bit nicer than the rock bottom ones. Believe it or not, $35 on AliExpress is a solid price for this particular model. The really cheap ones go for about $25. Note that this really is a thin case, just about 45 millimeters wide. It doesn't have front USB 3.0 ports, but the motherboard doesn't have a USB 3.0 header, so no big deal. It is designed with VESA mounts if you want to put it on the back of a monitor. Final comment, the I/O cutout is very small, just 25 millimeters tall, so it can accommodate only a thin mini-ITX board with a low-profile I/O shield. Last but not least is the CPU cooler. The cooler is kind of a key feature in these thin builds because you can't just slap on a stock cooler. Those things are too tall. Very few coolers fit these tiny HTPC cases. This cooler, the SilverStone SST-NT07, is one of them, one of the very few. It says it's rated for a 65-watt CPU, but I think the 35-watt CPU in this build will give this cooler all it wants. The fin stack on this cooler is pretty small because it has to be. There's no room for anything more. Okay, here's the full parts list. Additional items are nothing amazing. A couple sticks of RAM, a low capacity mSATA drive, and I love these mSATA drives, and a 90-watt power brick that plugs straight into the back of the motherboard through a barrel jack. The grand total is $173.88. If you are patient, you might be able to shave $10 or $15 off this price. More if you went with a cheaper case. Here is the build with everything installed in the case and the side panel removed. As you can see, my cable management game isn't up to snuff. Still, you can see all the key features. The CPU cooler is in the upper left. The CPU is under there somewhere. The mSATA drive is toward the bottom right. The SODIMM RAM sticks are on the bottom left. These visible cables are a mix of front USB 2.0 cables, the audio cables, and front panel connectors. There is also a CPU fan cable in there as well. There really is not a lot to see in these thin ITX builds. There just isn't any space for creativity. I have to come back to these mSATA drives. You can get used drives for pretty cheap on eBay. I got a mess of them with different capacities and loaded several different operating systems on this little computer. Each OS got its own mSATA drive. As you can see on the screen, I tried Raspberry Pi. It's actually the desktop version called Raspbian. It's a bit different. Android, GhostBSD, Zorin, which is a very Windows-like Linux distro, Mint, and Windows 10. I hadn't used most of these operating systems, so this was really interesting. The only one that really turned me off was Android, but that's because it's not a desktop OS. It's really made for touchscreens, so using a keyboard and mouse just doesn't feel normal. All of them installed pretty smoothly. There was one problem I encountered on this system. Being an Intel thin ITX board, this board meets all the thin ITX standards. That means it's less a desktop motherboard and more of a digital signage or all-in-one board. It has this weird EDP functionality. EDP stands for Embedded Display Port. I honestly don't know how EDP works, but I do know that it confuses the display settings. Initially, I had trouble with the system thinking I had two monitors, both my HDMI output and the EDP output. I have no idea where the EDP signal originates, but the system seems to be looking for it. This aggravated me to no end initially because the primary monitor is the EDP monitor, not the HDMI. I would open an application and nothing would appear on my monitor. It would appear on this invisible EDP monitor. It drove me crazy. After an embarrassingly long time getting frustrated, I finally found that you can disable the EDP functionality in the BIOS. That fixed everything except for GhostBSD. I had a hard time getting the monitor to configure properly in GhostBSD, and I also could not get the screen resolution up to 1080p. I suspect that I'm missing something, but GhostBSD probably has the least developed desktop interface of all the operating systems that I checked out. Anyway, EDP caused some angst. This motherboard, with its H61 chipset, supports Sandy Bridge CPUs. However, if you poke around the web and search for CPU compatibility, later versions of this board have an updated BIOS and support Ivy Bridge CPUs as well. This board has a code of 505, and that means it should take Ivy Bridge CPUs as well. That's kind of cool. So while I did all my testing of this board with the Sandy Bridge i3-2120T, I had an i3-3240T. That's an Ivy Bridge CPU, and it was sitting around. Here's what happened when I put it into the socket. This screen grab is from Specky, a program I like, though most people seem to use Hardware Monitor for this kind of thing. The board reads the Ivy Bridge CPU without any trouble. Note that Sandy Bridge CPUs officially support up to DDR3-1333. But with the Ivy Bridge CPU, you should be able to get up to DDR1600. I did put in a DDR3-1600 kit of RAM, and everything is actually fine. Note that the 1600 is mega transfers per second, but Specky reads the RAM speed correctly at 800 megahertz. This is kind of interesting to me. I knew that boards with an updated BIOS can sometimes take another generation of CPU. I did not know, however, that you can upgrade the RAM to align with the new CPU. In other words, I thought a Sandy Bridge board, regardless of BIOS updates, can only handle Sandy Bridge RAM speeds. Clearly, I need to learn more about memory controllers and such. With Ivy Bridge CPUs on the table, there are a couple interesting options. One is the i5-3470T. That's still 35 watts, but it does have a turbo, and I'm not sure of the turbo TDP. There is also the 45 watt Xeon E3-1333 which is 4 cores, 8 threads. I'm not sure about the thermals on the higher TDP values. Let's move to some benchmarks. At idle, the system ran at 12 degrees C over ambient, with just 17 watts from the wall. The Cinebench R23 scores were 494 for single core with 31 degrees over ambient and 31 watts from the wall. Then 1221 for multi-core scores, pushing to 38 degrees over ambient at 45 watts. This was the peak temperature I saw on this system. Ambient was 24 degrees Celsius, so the CPU temperature during the multi-core test was 62 degrees C. Not terrible, but this is a low power system. At some point, I will put a 45 watt CPU in the socket and see what happens. Moving forward, the Heaven score, and that was on medium, was 120 with a bump of 34C and a power of 40 watts. Finally, I did do some light gaming. That's Roblox with Lumber Tycoon 2, a personal favorite. At high max graphic settings, I could only get 8 FPS. A very choppy FPS, with a rise of 20 degrees C and power of 40 watts. There's nothing exciting here, but I don't feel you can do a build without some benchmarking. What did I think about this build? Well, first, I think these thin mini-ITX builds are awesome. Of course, if you are serious about gaming beyond Roblox or Minecraft or Minesweeper, the lack of a GPU is a deal breaker. For my use case, they are great, and the compact size is really cool, in my opinion. Second, I wasn't familiar with mini-SATA. It's an older technology, and I just hadn't seen it. It is perfect for these smaller builds. You avoid additional cables in the small case, and you still get SATA speeds for your storage. Third, the CPU fan. The SilverStone cooler is held up as the best super low profile CPU fan. Make no mistake, lots of CPU coolers claim to be low profile, but very few are actually low enough to fit in a 45mm tall HTPC case. This cooler design, however, does not give great coverage on the CPU. The corners are exposed. I've heard that the Intel cores are actually centrally located within the package. I don't know if this is true or not. Regardless, I would like to see the cooler contact the entire package. This CPU doesn't draw much power, and the SilverStone does just an okay job of keeping temps low. It would be a shame if the modest performance of this cooler were because of the lack of contact between the IHS and the cooling block. Next parting thought, I enjoyed messing around with Raspbian. Android, not so much. But seeing a bunch of different operating systems might have been the high point of this build. Next, the EDP feature of this particular thin mini-ITX board was a hassle. Problems that required digging in the BIOS exposed my lack of experience. Finally, desktop usage is fine for this kind of build. I'll probably keep this build for messing around with different tasks, although I admit I do have a 10th gen Intel system with a micro ATX motherboard for my regular work. Thanks for watching to the end. Let me know in the comments if you have a favorite non-Windows OS. Please consider subscribing or liking. Take care.